This is the final chapter of a three-part series on the history of Christian Zionism and the U.S. Israel relationship. In the first two chapters, we discuss the origins of Christian Zionism and the history of the U.S. Israel relationship, especially in the 19th and 20th century. But now we fast forward. Why is it that in the 21st century, Christian Zionists continue to support Israel, but on the other hand, many opponents continue to grow in their hatred, not only of Israel and the Jewish people, but also of the U.S. Israel relationship and those who support it? Let's find out.
The oil in the Middle East has been a major strategic interest for the United States, basically since Franklin Roosevelt was president. It was, for some of that time, from the 1970s through about the 2000 teens, the United States is actually heavily dependent on Middle East oil for our own consumption. But before and after that, we haven't been. Thanks to fracking now, things have changed. But back in the 40s and 50s, we were also a major oil exporter. But so it was never necessarily just about oil for ourselves, but the role of oil in the world economy. And that if any country, the Soviet Union, Nasser's Egypt, the Iranian mullahs, if any country had the power to close the Strait of Hormuz, that was seen, or otherwise to dominate that region in a way that they could blackmail the world economy over oil, that was seen as a fundamental challenge to American security, economic interests, and so on. You might say, well, why would you think that when, America doesn't need the oil ourselves? Well, as many of us have seen recently, it's partly because we may have plenty of oil in a physical sense, but the price it's a world commodity, and when the price goes up, it goes up for us too. So our price at the pump or to heat our homes and whatever goes up when somebody tries to close the strait. But also, think about, suppose there's no oil for Japan or China or Europe. What happens to those economies? The answer is, they crash. Well, what happens if that's happening? What happens to American companies that sell to them? What's happening on stock markets globally, financial markets? It's been seen that any country that's able to blackmail the world economy with the kind of financial and economic chaos that blocking that oil would cause is a danger to the sort of prosperity and stability that America since World War II has wanted and tried to help provide. And so Israel, interestingly, is a country that has a kind of, it's kind of aligned with us there. Because if there's a country that is strong enough to control the Gulf and control the region, that's a country that threatens Israel's existence. So if Nasser had been able to achieve his ambition and build a pan-Arab coalition that owned all the oil, it would have absolutely threatened the existence of Israel. If today, if the Iranian mullahs were able to build that kind of power network, Israel's existence would be threatened. If the Soviet Union had done it in the Cold War, Israel would have had to take whatever terms Moscow wanted to give it. So Israel and the United States have this core strategic interest. We don't want any other country to dominate the Middle East in a way that they could block the flow of oil. When we get to the question of values, that gets tricky. Israel is a democracy, remains a democracy. We are a democracy, remain a democracy. Neither one of us is a perfect democracy. Many of the people who are angriest about the way that Israel treats Palestinians are also angriest about the way Americans treat blacks and other racial and ethnic minorities. So, oddly, some of our deepest critics see us as aligned rather than non-aligned. I think Israel is a country whose fundamental ideas about liberty and about world order are compatible with ours. And I think that the Jewish movement of Zionism, the national movement of the Jewish people, is very much comes out of and reflects the same ideas and values that reflect the nationalist movements of European countries from Poland and the Czech Republic to Italy and France. I think that certainly when you look at the sort of technological creativity, commitment to innovation, Israelis and Americans are basically operating out of the same playbook. There's another thing about U.S. Israel policy, and that is most Americans don't really pay that much attention to foreign policy. It's kind of something that's way out there. Dean Acheson, a former Secretary of State, once said that he thought the average American had about 10 minutes a week to devote to the study of foreign affairs. It might not even be that much, to tell you the truth. However, there is one topic that is an incredible hot button for millions of Americans. Some because they just love Israel to pieces, and some because they absolutely hate it, right? And that is Israel, Palestine, that whole complex of things. It's such a hot topic. You can get riots on college campuses about it. You can get people breaking up with their significant others about it. You can have family fights. You can have street fights. You can have people screaming at each other on social media or whatever over this one thing. Now, for presidents, that's very interesting. You could see this when Joe Biden was president, that when he felt that he was kind of losing support on the left of the party and needed to sort of shore that support up, he could say, well, Palestinians have rights too, and they also deserve some consideration, and Israel is really going too far in Gaza. And then you get all of these people on the left wing of the party saying, yes, Joe Biden, you're not nearly as bad as we thought. This is terrific. That's great. But then if he thinks, I'm losing it on the right of the party or with the center, I don't know, he'd say, Israel has the right to defend itself. And everybody goes, oh, yes. Now, the thing is, the president can say either of those things, and it doesn't cost you a penny. You don't have to send any troops anywhere. You don't have to do anything. But by just giving a little tiny diplomatic signal, you can produce a huge political effect. This is a very useful thing for presidents of both parties, regardless of their actual feelings about the underlying issues. So when you try to think about the U.S.-Israel relationship, what you can see is, on the one hand, a kind of a strategic link that might wane or wax under different conditions. If no particular country looks like it's about to dominate the Middle East, then that U.S.-Israeli common interest kind of fades into the background. But if it looks like somebody really is on the verge of making that move, then suddenly we're back together. So it doesn't mean, this common strategic interest doesn't mean we're always aligned, always focused in exactly the same way. But it means in moments of crisis we tend to come together. But then on the other side, there's the political signaling. And presidents will be constantly trying to kind of weave a path between the strategic realities and the political signaling. By the way, the signaling isn't just domestic. If, the king of Saudi Arabia might come to the president of the United States and say, look, I need a favor. By the way, this is not the king talking, but me. Saudi Arabia, like Israel and like the United States, does not want any power, whether it's Iran or Egypt or Russia or anybody, dominating that region, because that's a threat to their independence and wealth, and they don't want that. And while we're supposed to think, there's the Jewish lobby and the Arab lobby, very, very often most of the Gulf Arabs and the Israelis are quietly aligned, sometimes more obviously like with the Abraham Accords, but even when that's not going on, they very, very often sort of see things from similar angles. Not identical, but similar. In any case, the king of Saudi Arabia might come into the White House and say, look, I want to help you with this, but your messaging about Israel and the Palestinians has been so much, it's creating political problems for me at home. And the president might well say, okay, fine, and then issue a statement, criticizing Israel over something, less because he's really mad at Israel than because he knows this will actually, this will help some of his Arab friends. There's all kinds of stuff going on here. It makes a certain amount of sense once you understand the interests of the different parties and how they're trying to manage their own political situations. But the combination of signaling, either to domestic or to international audiences, plus strategic connection, has a lot to do with American policy toward Israel. So you might ask now, so what's the point of whether you call them Christian Zionist organizations or groups like AIPAC or whatever? Do they actually move the needle? When do they move the needle? What I would say is this. There are certain ways in which a political lobby, not just on this stuff, but on anything, can kind of, in normal times, quietly just, make things go pretty well. You're not really getting anybody within limits. You can nudge a policy this way or that way. It helps a president when doing something that is strategically important really actually also gives you political benefits at home. And that, I think, has been a major force. That presidents supporting, even for Joe Biden, for whom supporting Israel was not universally popular in his party, the fact that there were a lot of Democrats, and there still are Democrats, who supported Israel and supported Biden for supporting Israel, made it easier for something to do that I think he would have tried to do anyway. It's interesting to see how not just in the U.S., but globally, attitudes toward Israel actually track with attitudes toward capitalism. That is to say, by and large, while in the 40s and 50s, being pro-Israel was a mark of being on the left, increasingly being pro-Israel is a mark of liking capitalism. And you can find, you go to Germany, and if you know somebody's opinion about Israel, you can probably predict their opinion about the United States, about NATO, and about free markets. So Israel attitudes are part of a kind of an ideological package. And when people move toward a kind of doubt in capitalism or resistance or opposition to capitalism, they tend to buy up a lot of other beliefs that are sort of seen to come with it, and one of them is being anti-Israel. Obviously, at the current time, Israel has been in the middle of the longest, bloodiest, and most brutal war of its history. Since the October 2023 attacks, Israel has been at war almost every day since then. The casualties are appalling. The damage in Gaza is unbelievable. And again, for a lot of, and there's a lot of global publicity on this. I mean, worse things can happen in a place like Sudan, but it doesn't register on people's sort of media consciousness or ideological consciousness as the way that things do in Gaza. So it's a very high profile, very emotionally charged and polarizing kind of thing. And we've seen in the past, by the way, that in Israel's wars, support for Israel drops. It dropped in around 1980 quite significantly over war in Lebanon. And many people actually at that time thought that Israel had lost the younger generation forever and that American public opinion would never be the same about Israel. In fact, it sort of bounced back and went on to become more pro-Israel after that war than before, ultimately, partly helped by 9/11. But this is a longer war. The effect could well be lasting. I don't know the future. People's attitudes toward Israel will likely evolve in other ways. Another part of the package is this idea of Israel as a colonial enterprise or a colonial state, sort of white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired northern people coming to kick a bunch of brown-eyed, brown-skinned people out of their ancestral lands, which is not actually a very good description of what happened in the modern state of Israel. True, there are refugees from Europe who were part of the Israeli population, but more Israelis today are actually descended from Middle Eastern Jews who were either forced to leave or fled mostly Arab countries, also Persia, Iran to some degree, where their ancestors had lived for hundreds or thousands of years. So but still, it's gotten itself embedded in this view of the world. You can look at a country like Ireland, where the resentment against British colonialism in Ireland and the settling back in the 1700s of a lot of Scots-Irish Protestants in what is now Northern Ireland is still this kind of open historical wound for many people. And a lot of people in the Republic of Ireland look at what's happening with Israelis and Palestinians as this is what happened to us. It's the same thing that happened to us, and it raises these feelings. In Algeria, they say this is just like what the French did in Algeria. In Malaysia, they say this is like how the British let all those Chinese into the Malay Peninsula and gave us this large Chinese minority that we still don't want. So it kind of echoes, it crystallizes for a lot of people these kind of anti-imperial, anti-immigration instincts of the past. And this situation, which I think, again, is historically quite different, but it elicits these emotions. And the kind of anti-colonial, post-colonial discourse is kind of intellectually fashionable in the U.S. these days. And often younger people are more exposed to intellectual fashion than older people. And I think this is part of the change that we're seeing. Yeah, we are seeing, I would say certainly not a majority, or even I think in numbers and polls a very large number, but we are seeing a kind of media significant and maybe even socially significant change in attitudes toward Israel and more fundamentally toward Jews in some sections of the right. This is, and I think, several things are going on here. One of them is just a return to normality, in that there's frankly always been a certain amount of anti-Semitism just on the right in the United States. William F. Buckley called Pat Buchanan an anti-Semite. And you can certainly go back in American history and find, a lot of examples in the Ku Klux Klan and other groups on the kind of radical right who saw Jews in a kind of conspiratorial way. They're not like us. They have a secret agenda, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that, but that would not account for everything that's happening. Some of it, I think, is a result of really the deep feelings that are building up about the high levels of migration to the United States. Earlier, we talked about how in the 1920s, the last time that migration reached this kind of percentage in the American population, there was almost a national frenzy to stop immigration, and we slammed the doors pretty tightly shut for almost 50 years until the late 1960s. We may be going through something in some ways similar to that today. Jews now are not really part of the migration wave. Then they were only a quite small minority of the migration wave, but nevertheless, when you're afraid that the things that when you feel that the country you know is being taken away from you by them, there's often a sense that, well, maybe the Jews are part of the them. And it is, historically, and even today, most American Jews are liberal in their ideology, and they have general and progressive. And so you can look at advocates for open immigration and so on, and there are a lot of Jewish names on those lists. So it's easy to kind of come up with some idea of an organized conspiracy. Conspiracy theories always interest me because what they really are is they're attempts to explain the very complex and often frustrating facts of modern life. They're a grand simplification that may not make you feel better about what's happening, but give you at least the illusion or the feeling that you understand it, and that's better. But anti-Semitism in particular is what I've written about as a stupidifying mind virus. That is, once you come to an idea like, okay, the Jews control banking, what this means is you lose any hope of ever understanding how the financial system actually works, because you have this kind of conspiracy theory. There's a they, and they make the banks do this, and they make the banks do this, and that's why this is why they're doing it. So, and then you stop. You don't stay curious. You don't test that hypothesis. You feel like, okay, I've got it now. And as you do this, and I think we can see this in some of the right-wing influencers who sort of start out with a few very superficial or, kind of mild versions of conspiracy theory, but before long are just spouting the most ridiculous nonsense that to their saner selves would have recognized, and sort of descend into this kind of pit of paranoia and, frankly, stupidity. So we're seeing this happen. I think it partly reflects the cultural dislocation of our time. Populism often leads to waves of anti-Semitism. William Jennings Bryan's famous speech at the 1896 Democratic Convention, where he says, "Thou shalt not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." That's actually an anti-Semitic dog whistle, because who allegedly crucified Jesus? The Jews. Who were the usurious bankers who are, in a clandestine way manipulating finance? The Jews. So, thou shalt not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. So when you have this kind of sense of the establishment as an all-powerful, mysterious, deeply evil force, pedophilia, it just all piles up. The Jews very often emerge as, the best scapegoat for this kind of thinking. And I'm afraid that some people at least are falling into this pit. I hope to God that as a people and a nation, we continue to avoid the deepest depths of this kind of thinking, because it truly leads nowhere good. Look, I do think that there are people who clearly do think that the United States and Israel have no interests and no values in common. That's, I see that they think that. I think that is certainly on the interest level. And to me, that seems clearly wrong. The United States and Israel both share an interest in preventing any hostile power from controlling the flow of oil from the Middle East to world markets in ways that could be used to blackmail the global economy and to blackmail the President of the United States. That seems actually to me very clear. Now, we might have, the Israelis might want to deal with that problem one way, and we might want to deal with it another. And that, you see that even in the Trump administration, that Netanyahu and Trump don't always agree on what to do. But I think it's clear that when they disagree, Trump, has had the final card to play. That is to say, Bibi can ask and he can scream and whine and he can dance around on the floor, but at the end, Trump does what Trump thinks is best for him. You sort of, part of the problem with this Americans as puppets thing is it's not only a conspiracy theory about how smart Jews are, it's a theory about how stupid we are. Okay? We are supposedly simple sons of the soil, those scheming, Jewish manipulators. We're no match for them because we're just plain innocent and dumb. Okay? I don't honestly think that's true. If you look at the record of the United States in the last 100 years, without us, Nazism, fascism would not have been destroyed, communism would not have been destroyed. We've screwed plenty of things up, but technologically, socially, economically, what Americans have done in the last 100 years just sort of would blow away any country in the history of the world by comparison. It's an extraordinary record of cultural innovation, technological invention, economic creativity, and actually political cleverness. To sort of think that we're just this kind of like stupid cow being led by the nose by these sort of brilliant, prancing Jewish elves who are 10 times smarter than we are is kind of stupid. And it strikes me that many of the people who think that that's the case are actually sort of stupider maybe than the average American. I do not actually think that the United States of America is being controlled by anybody. I mean, it's our politics. Israel, Israel is a country with its own interests, its own vision. In some cases they align with ours, in some cases they don't. American presidents sometimes get foreign policy right. They very often get it wrong, but our record is our own. Our mistakes are mistakes that we make for our reasons, and our successes come in the same way.
Thank you, Walter, for your many insights. We appreciate your wealth of knowledge and generosity in sharing it with us. For those who are watching, thank you for watching. I also would like to commend to you all of Walter's writings, but especially his book, The Ark of a Covenant. This book is Walter's work that covers all of these themes in much greater detail. I think you would very much enjoy it if you have enjoyed these videos. If you would like any additional resources, please do email us at education@passagesisrael.org or by leaving a comment below on any of these videos. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time.